Hey folks, welcome. My name is Michele, and in this video I want to talk about contemporary classical music and what is wrong with it. I post weekly videos about music composition and technical tutorials about algorithmic composition and multimedia composition. If these subjects interest you, feel free to subscribe and like the video. What is contemporary classical music? It's hard to give a definition, a musical definition of it. It is not really one genre. It has taken different forms. We could say that from a musical perspective, it tends to privilege some instrumentations that are that involve classical instruments, but that's not necessarily true. It tends to be performed into concert halls, but also that's not necessarily true. So let's try to give an historical perspective that might make more sense. So historically, contemporary classical music has been taught and practiced into learning institutions such as conservatories or universities. These institutions are meant to transmit the knowledge accumulated over the centuries to next generations. So in a way, contemporary classical music is part of an effort to transmit this knowledge and to continue this art form from one generation to the next. And while an instrumentalist might be learning an instrument in order to perform works of the past, a composer role is to inject new blood into the art form and to create new works more related to present times. Most composers would agree that their work is in a way advancing musical history, but they would not agree on what this advancement is. In the past, I made a video about modernism and postmodernism and how these two movements try to answer the idea of a musical progress in different ways. To cut to the chase, one of the points I'm trying to make in this video is that musical progress is one of the main motivators of contemporary classical composers. It is at the center of composition teachings in most of academia. Teachers try to instill in their pupils the idea of writing something that is not looking backwards, but it's moving the field forward. So one question I would like to ask is, first of all, is this idea of musical progress something that is desirable and beneficial to the art form, or are there some problems with it? Well, in theory, the idea of progress should not present any issue since, again, it's something that we as composers want to aspire to create something that is not a repetition of the past, but that moves us forward. But in practice, that has generated a sort of, I would argue, distortion of the impetus of composers. And I will try to explain how and why. I would argue that the idea of progress married to a top-down hierarchical system such as the one of musical institutions has created some problems and has stifled the creativity of a lot of composers. The idea of progress is actually very well suited for a setting like an academic as a university music department, since these departments are usually thought as centers for advancement of a certain research. This has created some ambiguity and blurring of the lines between music and science. Composers are seen as researchers that are producing research work to advance the field. And I think this is the first distortion that makes contemporary classical music sometimes hard to understand and follow, because we don't tend to think of music as a straight line of scientific advancement, but rather as something different and something that relates to a part of us that is not necessarily rational, and it's not necessarily able to point out which work is more advanced than others. The second sort of distortion is that this idea of progress has made contemporary classical composers very self-conscious about their work, as they have to always sort of compare what they're doing with the past and be very wary of being labeled as retrograde and backwards looking. So that's something that many composers would not be want to labeled as, and they would direct their efforts in ways to be perceived as cutting edge and at the forefront of the musical research. And the third problem, it relates to the hierarchical top-down system that I was mentioning before. And it is a problem of having feedback only from a certain circle of people, and it's a limited circle of people, of practitioners of contemporary classical music, that usually are not motivated by the same instincts of a general audience. They have been educated in looking for this idea of progress in music, and disregarding the works that do not embody this very idea, and disregards work that might be very valuable but are not perceived to be advancing the field. But why is this idea of progress so pervasive in contemporary classical music? Well, one, I just mentioned that in an academic setting, the idea of progress goes very well hand in hand with the mission of the institution. It also overlaps with the idea of progress as it was thought out by the avant-gardes of the 60s and 70s. In my video about Theodor Adorno and his influence on contemporary classical music, I addressed this issue, how Adorno was very much into the idea of progress, into an idea of being adversarial to the general public in order to push the new music forward and to achieve a sort of truth, what he called the truth in music. So the idea of progress is well suited both for the top-down academic institution where contemporary classical music tends to be taught and performed, and also it goes very well with the ideology of progress that was pushed by the avant-gardes of the 60s and 70s. We have to acknowledge that contemporary classical composers live in this environment where in order to move upwards in their career, they have to consider these aspects. They cannot just move independently. They cannot just chart their own path, as that might not be conducive of the prizes that this career has. So in short, I would argue that this idea of progress married with a top-down system of musical institutions has been overall detrimental to the fostering of musical creativity for contemporary classical composers. It has made the composers self-conscious about their work and responsive to an audience, a small audience of experts, while disregarding a broader audience, which does not respond in a uniform manner, and can provide composers with different sort of feedbacks, which in a way leaves the composer freer to experiment with different ideas, and ideas that might not be just based on the idea of pushing the art form forward, but might branch out in different direction and explore past practices, maybe reinvent them. There are a lot of different solutions that the contemporary classical music world is left out of because of this idea of ingrained progress into the institution. So having a preconceived mission, and being worried about the contingent perception of what new music is, and being and feeling constrained by problems that are not musical, such as the general idea of progress, I think are in general detrimental to contemporary classical music. And we can argue that composers that operate outside of these institutions are pressured by other incentives, like market pressure and so on. But I would argue that these pressures are in a way more chaotic, and they're not as organized, not as structured, so that the composer does feel free to operate in different ways, and might not have the safety of an institution such as a university or as a conservatory to provide for a living, but is freer to experiment and see how the general audience might have some space for his or her musical thinking. And so in that way, operating outside of the contemporary classical music world might be healthy, even for composers that want to write music that is in a way difficult and is not for a broad audience. So I would like to close by saying that I hope that in the future the world of contemporary classical music will take into consideration to add some sort of check from the outside, check from an audience that is not motivated by the same ideas of the experts in the institutions, but might provide a more kind of out-of-the-box sort of thinking that might be rewarding out-of-the-box thinking in contemporary classical music. So I hope this was interesting. It was my 2 cents about the situation. Every composer will have different perspectives about this, but if you think that there is some truth in what I said, let me know in the comments, and I would gladly reply. Thank you for watching, and until the next time, take care.